So let me start also with thanking the organizers and Metropolis for inviting me here to talk a little bit about actually 300 years of Swedish population and migration development. I'm an economic historian, so I want to have the big picture, if you would say. And for Sweden this is probably possible because we have actually data on this. Here you see the population development of 1749 to 2012. And you see it's actually rather unique that you have these kind of data, and the reason is for this is that in Sweden they started with censuses from this date of 1749. First every 2 years and later every five years up to 1990, where we got a computerized register data basically, so we could follow it by date basically. Under pressure of mercantilist ideas, and among them that a large population, working population is important for the economic growth, these censuses were already very yearly gathered basically, both on live births, deaths and marriages, by age and sex, and later on immigration for Sweden. This unique material gives us the possibility to shed some light on the demographic development from the agricultural era to the industrial into the post-industrial times for Sweden. And as you can see, the population increased almost fivefold from 2 million in 1750 to 9.5 million today. Of course, this natural increase, like any other population, consists of both live births, deaths, immigration, and this was talked already about this morning, that population development consists of a number of drivers, and so that's what we're going to look at in the following slides. So here we have live births and deaths over this whole period, and somebody talked already this morning a little about the demographic transition, and as you see, phase one, Sweden is in the agricultural, is still a traditional agrarian society with high mortality and fertility due to low living standard and returning diseases, and this is say from 1750 to about 1810. Also this phase was characterized by the household as the unit of production and consumption, and a high number of children was needed to keep population on a relatively steady level. Then we go to phase two of this demographic transition, and in Sweden it starts in the first decades into the 19th century and is characterized by a gradual lower level of mortality. Connected to this is the idea that it's also gradually the industrial production increased, as well as an increased food production by changes in the agricultural sector, and led to that more people survived, especially infants, and gave way to a gradual population increase. So fertility just increased as it always had done, but actually mortality fell. For Sweden this meant that the population increased from 2.4 million in say 1800 to about 5 million in 1900. So over 100 years period it doubled, in spite of a very high level of emigration, and I will show you that in the next picture. The phase three of this sort of population development is then characterized by a gradual falling fertility rate, which for Sweden is depicted at the end of the 19th century, or more precise, in the decade after 1880. One of the reasons for this lower fertility is that the household as a production unit became less important. Work in industry and factory also by women implied that the need for large families was less necessary. Norms and institutions on how many children a family should have changed and led gradually to smaller households. Lower infant mortality also led to that fewer children had to be born to have the desirable number of children. And finally, phase four, and it is pretty early in Sweden, so we talk about 1910, 1920, 1930. For Sweden, we're at the end of the demographic transition, and it is sort of completed and is characterized by both low levels of live births and deaths. But what you also see is this hump that's going, for example, take the 40s, what is called the 40 years in Sweden. It's just after the Second World War, basically during the Second World War already, but also there, you see this hump, and it transplants itself also in the 1960s, so that are the children of that hump, then in sort of the late 80s and early 90s, and you see now the hump is again there. So it transplants itself, which of course has effects on how you deal with certain things in society. If we then go to immigration and emigration, this we have statistics from 1850, and then they were first available. And as you can see from the picture, it can broadly be divided in two periods. One from 1850 to 1930 and dominated by out-migration, and one dominated by in-migration from the 1930 up to present. If we remind us the former picture on the demographic transition, we can also see broadly that the out-migration period is connected to the second phase of the demographic transition, in which a larger population is created due to still high live births, but a gradual lowering of the mortality in society and creating a larger population. At the same time, the agricultural production and productivity increased, which also led to increased unemployment. Both this as well as the population surplus from agriculture were sort of the preconditions for growth in the industrial sector. And of course, part of these surpluses were taken into, absorbed by this growing industrial sector. However, another large part of this population surplus emigrated to especially the Americas, USA. Approximately 25% of the Swedish population emigrated from Sweden between 1850 and 1925. So, in absolute numbers, about 1.2 million moved away from Sweden. The latest research has also shown that the out-migration to the US not alleviated the labor market situation in Sweden only. As everybody knows, it also helped to overcome the demand for labor in the US during these decades. The large immigration from Sweden did also that the wage gap between Sweden and the US diminished over time, which in return led to lower levels of out-migration. So you see first large out-migration, but slowly it goes down. And it has basically to do with that it was better in Sweden, industry took up and people got jobs. And what you see at the end, and in 1920s for example, it's temporary migration to the United States. The introduction of quotas in the US and the changing political situation in Europe in the 1930s then make that migration flow from and to Sweden became historically very low. And you see then we see also an in-migration, and in the 1930s it's actually Swedes that return from the US, that is the in-migration to Sweden. Since the 1930s, and that we put in this picture, and especially after the Second World War, immigration started to be a significant component of the Swedish population development. Whereas during the 1930s and the 1940s, the growth of the Swedish population mainly was due to more live birth. Over that, a gradually diminishing natural increase coincided with larger positive net migration in the 1950s and 60s. Both positive net migration and natural increase are dropping in the early 1970s, as you see, where after positive net migration has been larger than natural increase. What we also can see from the figure is that only in the early 1970s Sweden experienced a negative net migration, as well as that only in the late 90s it experienced more deaths than live births. Otherwise, during the entire period, both net migration and natural increase does that the Swedish population increases. Immigration to Sweden since the Second World War can again be described in two periods. One in which labor migration dominated and in time was during the 1950s and the 1960s especially. The oil crisis of the 1970s put a halt to the labor migration, but was gradually taken over by refugee and family reunion migration during the 1980s and 90s. Interestingly, the new millennium gave Sweden an all-time high when it comes to migration. Both EU migration, since 1995 Sweden is in the EU, Refugees and family reunion are the major categories for the large immigrations flow into the country. So also during this economic crisis, Sweden has a very large immigration. A couple of explanations, sort of. One important feature of Sweden is how it over the last decades developed into a welfare state, where gradually the state guarantees or basically takes over some of the local and individual responsibilities, if you take this over the long period, of course. Provisions around education for all, both for men and women, provisions around pensions, are basically more or less common in most countries. But for Sweden, we see also that there are a number of other things that have provided for both, what I would say, was it the natal policy, as you say?
Pronatal?
Pronatal policy, you could say, and of course a migration policy. In Sweden, and in particular after the Second World War, a tax-based social transfer and individual taxation, also for women, so women are individually taxed, not in a household taxation, since 1969, has led to a high labour force participation of both men and women, which also enabled the provision for relatively high child allowance, cheap childcare provisions for kids between 1 and 10 years of age, and a gradual increasing number of months for parental leave. At the moment it's 18 months and 80% of your salary, and which are two are actually for the male part. These provisions are the political background to the still high life birth rate in Sweden over the last five decades, and that Sweden's population still is increasing. Another feature, as we saw in the earlier figures, is the positive net migration to Sweden over the last 5 decades. Interestingly, the migration policy employed by Sweden has shifted from liberal in the 1950s and 60s to more restrictive in the 1970s and 1980s. Entering the EU in 1995 saw a gradual shift to more immigration to Sweden from other EU countries, but finally in 2008, so the current policy is extremely liberal, basically. And according to the OECD, is it the most liberal immigration policy. Accepting free labor migration, as well as still conducting relatively liberal rules for refugee and family during the migration, makes that we have this all-time high. Moreover, in general, Sweden sees immigration as a positive phenomenon, at least by the current sort of government, and has covered over the last decades both established and improved its integration policies to enhance both political, social, and most of all economic integration of immigrants. And I refer here to the MiReKoc, which is Migration Policy Index, and Sweden tops it. These are policies. That doesn't mean that the integration is always going wonderful. Finally, the future then, because there is of course a connection to this. And what we see here is that also Sweden will have an increased population, and we see both, and this is in Sweden, sorry for that, so we see live births is föda, that is döda. It's not that difficult to understand, but you see that still will increase in that sense over this period. Also, when it comes to immigration, the idea is that we will have a net migration over the period from 2010 to 2060, which will mean that Sweden in the end will get 11 million people or something like that at the end of 2060 or 2060. Just to wrap up, sketching the demographic and migration development of Sweden over a very long time, and we find a strong connection between the two phenomena, and I understood that basically migration is part of demography, so it's actually should be discussed as part of the same picture. As an economic historian, of course, migration is connected to both structural economic changes, business cycle variation, both at home and where the migrants come from, and of course also economic crisis. has affected both fertility, mortality and migration flows, and Sweden is just an example in this. And it should be at the core of the analysis of changes in populations, of course. Finally, I think it can be argued for Sweden, maybe on the margin, that various policies actually affect also both demographic policies and demographic and migration development in certain directions. And I think Sweden is also a case in this. And also returning to Ahmed, by the way, Sweden, pro-natalist policies, yes. Immigration policies, yes, we have them as well. Enlargement policies, Sweden is actually pro that Turkey comes into the EU, so I would say yes there as well. Retirement policies, yes, we have a good retirement. I mean, we dealt already this with 20 years ago, early 90s. We dealt with the how we would do with the pension system. And we have, yes, our large labor force participation rate for women. So it looks almost like I'm from the government, I think.